Mark Graban and Jamie Flinchbaugh are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a fun spirit.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 34 of Lean Whiskey. I'm Mark Graban, and we are joined again today by
Jamie Flinchbaugh. Glad to be here.
You hear Jamie pouring something. We'll reveal what that something in the theme is. I've already poured mine. I'm being good about waiting to take a sip, but maybe our first sip, we will cheers. It's third birthday of the podcast. I think we forgot to mention that last time.
We forgot to recognize it all together. So, happy birthday, Mark. I think a bunch of people think this is a pandemic project.
It actually started April 2019. Now, I think we were able to do more of them during the pandemic. I mean, this is our third episode of the year. I think originally your forecast was like, maybe we can do one every 2 months. And I think we managed to do that more often during pandemic times.
We did. And we used that time to bring more guests on and all sorts of other things. So, so we picked up the pace a little bit. And, since this is more for fun than marketing, we kind of get one done when we can. And I still remember, I think we were using Skype.
Did we that first time?
I think so. I know it wasn't Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember I was in a hotel in Pittsburgh for a board meeting, and I think that's when we had the technology issues and again stuff that we've all grown more accustomed to dealing with since then. But that was still 2019. So 3 years in.
Forever ago, pre-pandemic. That seems like such a long time. And like you said, we do this because we're enjoying it, and if anyone else listens, that's a bonus. And we weren't doing this to set the world on fire. We've had over 12,000 downloads and listens to date across those episodes. So we do want to say thank you to anybody who has been listening. We appreciate it.
Yep. Yeah. Just looking at our very first whiskeys. Our first theme was non-Kentucky whiskey. So I had some Wyoming whiskey, and you had some Garrison Brothers.
Texas. Yeah.
As you're known to do.
Yeah.
And that was our very first one way back when. So. And here we are, episode 34.
Here we are. So we've got, as usual, we've got a bit of a plan. This isn't scripted by any means. And we're going to start off talking a little bit about what's new. Do you want to go first, Jamie?
Well, yeah, I think your what's new is more exciting. So why don't I'm going to feel like an undercard here anyway.
What's new is what's about to be new for me. Last 11 days of August, we've got a vacation planned. I'll talk about this maybe in the next episode. So sorry to rub this in. We are going to Scotland. More particularly, we're going to be going to Islay and Jura and Campbelltown. We're going to be visiting distilleries, of course. So this has been, I've been to Scotland before, but going to Islay in particular is a bucket list trip.
That's
for
Mecca.
sure.
Yeah, that's Mecca. That's for Scotch lovers at least. But that's it. Now is that where? And I'm horrible with these names. Bruichladdich.
Yep,
that's where Bruichladdich is, right?
You said that perfectly. It's a crazy spelling. We're some of our stops include Bruichladdich, Lagavulin, Laphroaig. We're going to Springbank in Campbelltown, which is a favorite. As well. But these are isles that getting there involves planes, boats, and automobiles instead of planes, trains, and automobiles. So we have a guide that we've used, and he's booked. There's ferry trips involved. These are not easy places to get to. So really, really fortunate to have the opportunity.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I started my whiskey drinking not specifically with Lafroig, but that was really one of my doorways into all of this. And I, uh, I drink Lagavulin, on a not a continuous basis, on a regular basis.
Right.
But Bruichladdich is one that I've never had a chance to try, but I'm really looking forward to the chance to have one. I just haven't found one in the stores, and need to make that happen. So
I've got 2 bottles here. It would be great to share with you sometime. 2 bottles of Bruichladdich to taste them side by side. One is basically the same distillate unpeated, and then the peated. People associate peat with Islay, but not everything that's made in Islay is peated. So Bruichladdich, they mix it up sometimes and surprise you maybe with something that's not peated.
Yeah, I mean they do say that because the water flows through that marshland and carries a little peat with it just in the water. But yeah, the actual peated process, and of course the measurement that they do around peating, the peat levels. Yeah, it's the Isle is known for it, but yeah, it's not the only thing they do, right?
I'll come back with some process reports because we'll be going to Gemba of not just where it's distilled, but going upstream in the value stream. See, this is why it's lean whiskey, right?
Mm-hmm.
We will get to see the malting floor, and then back downstream of that. I'm next time I'll talk through the value stream in order, maybe. But then when they dry the malted barley, that's the point where you're either using peat on the fire or not. So I think the first time I learned that was a little mind blowing. That the smoke is in the barley and it doesn't get distilled out, right? So when I said a minute ago that wasn't really precise when I said it's the same distillate, peated or unpeated, it's really the same process with the same type of barley, and whether or not that peat has been introduced at that point or not. But it does create end result wise, you can do that comparison of here's how it tastes without peat versus with, because sometimes the peat it adds so much. It's interesting to see what you taste without the peat.
Yeah, no, it's it sounds like a fun trip. Of course, it helps to have a spouse who also enjoys whiskey, and I do not. I keep trying, but yeah, I'll definitely need to get over there. My last trip to Scotland, which was now quite a while ago, was a work trip, and we were in Troon, in Troon, but never made it to any place like that. Didn't even have a car, so yeah, missed out on that chance, but I'll have to make that happen one of these days.
Yeah. So to talk about next time, but now more work related, as we always bounce back and forth between whiskey and lean and work talk. You've been doing some fun stuff related to your alma mater, one of your alma maters.
Yeah. So I've been quite involved lately at Lehigh, helping get launched a ventures lab, which is meant to help mostly recent graduates get their businesses off the ground that want to launch, right? So traditionally, there's more and more student entrepreneurs who want to build a business, but they graduate, you just send them off into the wild. So good luck, right? And instead, it's what help can we give them, structure can we give them? So until we get a real program together, and we have tons of cool support from the university and leaders, but and I'm just acting as an advisor and support. But we will be bringing in a director very soon. But until then, we had three students who had recently finished their studies that really had some momentum, and we're going to go forward anyway. And so it was a shame if we didn't support them. So I'm spending about a day a week at the university this summer. Not quite a day, but a good chunk of a day a week. Working with these three, highly energetic, fast-moving just starting off founders. But great, great program, and it keeps me sharp too. Not dissimilar to what I do with experienced CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies, but just a different set of topics usually. So.
Yeah. Well, it's fun to be in different ways or different settings, around younger employees. I had the opportunity last week to go down to Austin and spend 2.5 days with the team at KaiNexus. And Jamie has been an investor. I've been involved with the company in different ways for 11 years and have invested as well. But the team there, I mean, it's more than 30 people. They're back into an office again. Before the pandemic, the team there in Austin was about ready to outgrow the place. So they were going to have to find something new anyway. And then with the pandemic, things have been very virtual. Now that Austin team is coming back to a newer, bigger, nicer office. And, just to see, I mean, just the energy of that team is really invigorating. I mean, I feel like it's more for my benefit, the boost I get, than any sort of advice or mentoring. There's some of that, but that mission is strong. Spreading continuous improvement. It's not just about the software platform. And Greg and Matt, as co-founders, have done a great job of hiring people where even if they don't come in the door knowing all the lean lingo, they share, important principles and mindsets and values. Even then, they learn some language that a lot of people, including our customers, use. Right. But having that fit, and they're just great to be around. They're doing great work.
Yeah, and that's awesome. That sounds like a fun week. I have a couple people that support me, and there's sort of a mini team, but I do miss sort of being part of a team. Both my time at Corvo and my time running my old consulting firm with Andy. I miss that team spirit, but maybe just put an exclamation mark on the idea of us talking about the young people.
Right.
My excitement is we got a new mattress delivered today, and I'm probably as excited for that as you are for your Scotland trip. So, when you're that excited for a new mattress, that that's maybe certain mark of age that that's something we were normally that excited about. But that's my big day.
The importance of a good night's sleep and waking up feeling refreshed in the morning. Yeah.
Oh, well, I will. I kept saying that it felt our old mattress was sort of so old. It felt like I was sleeping in a hammock.
Right.
Not good for my back. So.
No. Well, I hope you got a good one there.
Hope so.
It works out.
They say 30 to 45 days till you really get used to it, which is why sleeping in hotels as much as I have is indicative of you never get used to it, right? So.
Different mattresses, different pillows, and mattresses like whiskey. A lot of it's subjective. What works for you, right?
Yep, absolutely. So let's get into our whiskey since we've already raised a glass. So we're going to do as we're 34 episodes in, finding new themes. Finding new themes is kind of difficult, even though there's so many different ways to split the whiskey world. So we're going to do distillery only special bottles. So for those that have just gone to their local store and bought whiskey, what they should know is that when you do visit a distillery, even a major, right? This is not just the minors, especially if you go to a micro distillery or a craft distillery, they might have only one or two of their bottles that they sell, their expressions, as it said, in a store. But then they'll have 10 other things that they never do enough volume in to sell in a store. You only can get them there. Now, the majors, what the majors tend to do is they'll have one, right? They'll have their regular expressions you can find in stores, and then they'll have maybe one and a lot of the majors are so popular, they put a lot of limits on it, like one bottle per customer, and it's not always available. But yeah, well, that's the kind of distillery special that we're talking about.
I think a lot of times they're trying to give a special treat to people who have made the pilgrimage to come and visit them. They don't want people buying a case and reselling it.
Right. No, and they know that happens, and no, I'm totally fine with that rule.
Yeah,
I think it's fair because we've seen enough with just regular retail where hard to find stuff is gobbled up and then sold at a like Weller Antique. It sells for 3 times regular, real MSRP. So yeah, and if you go to a place, pay for a tour, all those wonderful things, visit the location, you want to be able to say you got something you couldn't buy anywhere else. So I happened to be in Lexington recently and swung out to Four Roses.
Yeah, great place.
Great place, and Four Roses is interesting because they really only have sort of 4 main expressions that they sell. One of which is their single barrel, but then this is their private selection single barrel. So got a nice little leather. I'm not all about the bottle, but a nice little leather wrap around the neck. And just opened this, so only been home for about a week. Just opened this and just had my first couple sips, but I do like Four Roses. It probably, if I could only have one whiskey the rest of my life, it's probably not what I would pick. But it's smooth, it's light, it's often got the Four Roses don't have anything to do with the whiskey in the bottle.
Yeah,
but it does often have a little more floral or scent to it or nose to it. But yeah, so this is Four Roses only has 2 mash bills. One's a higher rye. This one's from their higher rye mash bill, which is 35% rye. And then they have, I think it's 5 different yeasts. So they have 2 mash bills, 5 different yeasts, which actually leads to basically 10 different final flavors in barrels, which then get blended to create those 4 main recipes.
It's a combinatorial whiskey of all these different possibilities. Yes. You can do the math on how many different bottlings could you produce.
Right. So this is, the single barrel, though, is only going to be one of those 10 different variations. So in their designation, this is OBSF. For those who are watching on YouTube, they might see that a little bit. Doesn't focus terribly well. OBSF, which is their high rye mash bill, and the yeast that yields herbal notes in the taste. So and like I said, quite good. I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, I've done the Four Roses visit. I think when I went there, at the time it was an exclusive over a release that's now widely available called Small Batch Select.
Yes.
But that was just coming to market. So they were making it available there. And if I'm remembering some of the trivia right, because you get these details when you go there, for decades, Four Roses was export only. It was not available in the United States. I think it was very popular in Japan, if I remember.
Yeah, so Four Roses was one of the 4 or 6, I always forget the number, that were allowed to operate during Prohibition under medicinal reasons. And then they were huge, right? They were huge distillery, one of the largest, if not the largest. And then, as the whiskey boom ended and people didn't drink it anymore, and they drank all sorts of other things, vodka, gin, and wine. Seagram's bought them, shut down most of it, sent most of the whiskey to go get blended into their other stuff, and then did sell Four Roses out of the country. And then when they were, brought back, when they were bought, not bought back by the founders, but they were bought by someone else, and I forget now who. owns them, but they brought it back to the U.S., brought back the distilling and all of what they were known for back in the day. So yeah, like a lot of these guys, they've been through the ringer, and some of them, like Old Crow, that used to be, top shelf, got pushed to the bottom, mass production, cheap, never really recovered. I mean, they sell, but they've never regained their reputation. And some, like Four Roses, have come back from their deathbed, and really cool story.
So I looked this up. The parent company is Japanese. It's Kirin Brewing Company. So people might know Kirin Beer. The one distillery that I got to visit in Japan in 2019 was a Kirin distillery. People might not associate them with whiskey. So sort of like Jim Beam was purchased by Suntory. Then you've got Kirin involved with Four Roses. And there was some other history there at Four Roses. They had these old advertisements, and I don't know the exact time frame, but like well after Prohibition, for decades, it was literally illegal to directly market spirits to women in the United States. That you could not show a woman in an ad drinking whiskey. And I think they were talking about how then if the workaround, if you couldn't show a woman drinking bourbon, is that you would show images that might be seen as this is, I think, a very 1950s Mad Men view of the world. So this is not me proclaiming this, but they would use imagery, let's say, like roses in advertisements as a way of sort of trying to signal, women, please buy our whiskey too. Please drink it. Please drink it also.
Yes. Now the Four Roses itself actually comes from the founder had was courting a woman and was supposed to wear, if her answer was yes after the proposal, was supposed to wear a red rose if she was saying yes, and she came out with 4 red roses, and so it was named. And who knows if that was true or just a good story to tell afterwards. But that was the history behind the Four Roses. So that's mine. What about what do you have there?
So I am drinking. I will hold it up for the YouTube audience. There we go. I think it's focusing. This is Woodinville Straight Bourbon Whiskey. It's a distillery release. I was in Woodinville, Washington, which is north of Seattle, for work a couple of months back, and had time to go pop over there and do a taste. And this was a what they call a harvest release from 2021, and that's only available there at the distillery. So it's a 5-year age statement, straight bourbon whiskey, 50% ABV. But then it spent some time, I think, undisclosed, being finished in Muscatel wine barrels. So you might think of like Moscato. It's a sweet wine, and so I think they're trying to give a little bit of kind of an additional sweet finish. Like I'm not Mr. tasting notes guy, but I get like kind of a maple syrup, not an obnoxious sweetness, but I think it's pretty nicely balanced into what the bourbon would be without that finishing.
Okay.
So I've been enjoying this one.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun. Now when you travel like that, do you tend to check your bags so you can bring a bottle back?
I did check the suitcase. Yes. I brought 2 bottles back. I brought back one that I think was port barrel finished, which is more widely available. I'm a wine drinker, and I'm kind of partial to different wine barrel finishes. And I don't recall ever having a Muscatel finished bourbon before. That was new to me.
I don't think I've ever even seen that. So now Dad's Hat Rye, which I know I've brought onto the our show, and this is one of these specials that I've never seen in a store. They had a vermouth finish rye, and I did not buy a bottle of that. I think I should have. I think I will next time I go down there. Yeah, I mean, I love a good port finish. Of course, sherry finishes are quite quite common. But yeah, I think it's fun to see those other experiments, those other expressions come through. So
Yeah,
sounds very interesting.
and you mentioned, back in our first episode, we focused on bourbons outside of Kentucky. Today, we've got a mix. You've got a classic Kentucky bourbon, and then I've got one from the Pacific Northwest, a relatively new producer. You can make good bourbon anywhere in the United States, and that's the thing. It's got to be, it's an American designation.
Yep, absolutely. So awesome. Well, good choices. I'm enjoying mine. It's got it's 106 proof. Got some decent heat on it. So got to take my time with it. But why don't we get into our topic for the day?
Yeah. So instead of in the news today, it's really sort of in the podcast, and at the risk of gratuitously plugging one of my other podcasts, I had an episode that I shared with Jamie recently of the My Favorite Mistake podcast, and we thought it would be a good springboard for discussions around not just entrepreneurship, but improvement and evaluating ideas, and how do you know if something is a good idea or a mistake. So I was able to interview the founder. He had been CEO. He's now the chairman of 1-800-Flowers, Jim McCann. I don't know, Jamie, do you remember the face or the voice? He did a lot of TV commercials in the 80s.
I remember that there was one,
yeah,
but that's about all I remember. But yeah, I mean, very, very big breakthrough, and Flowers was very dominant by one shop owner operator places that unfortunately were very hit and miss whether you would get good service. And of course, if you were sending flowers to someone in a town you didn't know, you were desperate trying to find who to call to try to send some flowers.
So he started, just the summary of Jim McCann's story. He bought one flower shop in New York City. I think it was in Brooklyn. And then he was buying and more. And he said, basically, that wasn't scaling well, just having more and more physical shops. So I don't know the history of when, let's say, FTD came to be. Like, that's a big network of independent shops, but there's some branding and commonality in product. And I think if you've had good experiences with FTD, you would trust FTD. He decided, or he realized that there was the opportunity to acquire the phone number 1-800-Flowers, which meant buying a company, because the phone company assigned a number to the company. You don't really own it. So he had to buy the company to get the phone number, which you'd say the phone number is brilliant. Like he said, instead of having to force people to memorize your number, 1-800-Flowers, it's as easy as could be. The problem was he basically thought he could be cheap and not do due diligence. So in buying the company, yes, he got this asset. He also took on $7 million worth of debt. Whoops. So it was an expensive purchase. It was the mistake that was hiding in the really good idea. But that's episode 172. I think Jim McCann was really insightful. If people want to go listen to that, My Favorite Mistake. But he told the story in the middle there that I thought was fascinating, and this is where we can springboard off of this. Early on, when they were starting to do shipping of flowers, not just fulfilling from local florists, Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, told Jim McCann that shipping flowers via FedEx wouldn't work, that it would be a mistake, that it was a bad idea. And I think there's kind of a fun irony there when all sorts of people told Fred Smith that FedEx itself was a mistake, right? This is taught in business school, how people poo-pooed FedEx, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think Fred Smith had his own pivots and what he thought the opportunity was. I think they focused on legal documents for quite a while, just trying to get documents back and forth, and had some sense at least about what worked and what didn't work in terms of shipping. Even though they were operating quickly, right? They were still trying to jam as many packages into a plane as possible. But yeah, when somebody in the business that would benefit from you, basically Fred Smith, I'll take your money, right? I'll ship some stuff for you. But he still said, it wouldn't work, which I think is very interesting. And I think flies, I'll say it flies in the face of the typical, that won't work pushback, because the sort of status quo of advice is, when you get pushback on an idea that you believe in, just go find somebody else. Right. But this still was, about, McCann and Smith's partnership. And so he didn't find somebody else. He basically ultimately, I guess, convinced.
Well, it might be one of those things where let's try it and see. I mean, sometimes you have to do that, whether it's trying to launch a business or launch a product. If you can do that test of change, which to me reminds me of continuous improvement, right? If it doesn't seem dangerous or illegal, at some point, just go test the idea, because it's easy to be a naysayer. It's easy to be just blindly optimistic about your own idea. I mean, but it's interesting you mentioned legal documents. I mean, if they had defined the company as we ship legal documents, they would have been put out of business by the internet and DocuSign or things like that. Right. Sort of like you think of you were going to mention Netflix. I mean, if Netflix had defined itself strictly as we mail DVDs to people, that wouldn't have been a lasting business. But tell us more. I mean, you had thoughts about Netflix there, right?
Well, yeah, because I mean, a lot of this theme is going somewhere with an idea that has not yet come to fruition, right? So not being a fast follower, but bringing something into existence that doesn't exist yet. So Netflix has been an example of that really twice, and you could argue maybe three times. But they started off with basically mailing DVDs, right? And the whole idea was, you get a customized DVD video experience. You get to pick stuff that you really want, what you're interested in. It shows up at your door, and you don't have to, drive to Blockbuster and all of those things.
Yeah, and I was a customer of that service 20 years ago when I first got a DVD player, and the selection at Blockbuster maybe wasn't that good yet. They still had a ton of VHS.
Yep. Yeah. So I wasn't. I assume I was probably just still using Blockbuster at the time. But yeah, they, so much where they knew, and everybody thought you can't ship these things back and forth. That Blockbuster had a chance to buy them early on and turned it down, right? And that was a mistake. So they had this idea that nobody believed in, Blockbuster, who was even inside the industry. And it wasn't they were poo-pooing their competitors' idea. They like I said, they could have bought them. They turned down that chance, and that almost killed Netflix. But then they did it again with really investing in streaming, not because they needed to. In fact, at the time when they started making that switch over, the bandwidth wasn't even suitable to stream. Like, very few people had enough bandwidth that streaming was going to work. But they started going there before it was feasible, let alone a good idea, right? And so they invested early. And then I'll say the third time, maybe, and I just don't know my history well enough, is they were, if not the first, one of the first to say, you know what, content is what we're really delivering. We're going to invest in our own studio and start to develop our own content. So yeah, they're sort of, and I know they're struggling now, right? But
they've had a decline in subscribers, and that's one of those things. Like, Peloton was another example of seeing a spike in demand during the pandemic, and then you start extrapolating that. Like, well, some of that turned out to be a mistake. More painful when it's physical products, perhaps. They Peloton, not to get too sidetracked on them, they made the mistake of building this enormous factory in Ohio that I read the other day will probably never be used by Peloton, because they really overestimated demand. And good on them that they were going to try to assemble these in the US, but the demand spike was not sustained.
Right. Yeah. So I think, if you go look at Fred Smith, you look at Jim McCann, you look at Netflix, these are all companies that the core of what they did for their customers, right? Their value proposition was ahead of its time. And I only mean that, they weren't so far ahead of their time that they fell flat, because that happens too. They were far enough ahead of their time that their customers weren't asking for the solution they were providing yet.
Yeah.
But they saw the value. They saw the value beyond the customer's words, beyond the customer's intent, and were able to create something when a lot of people thought it was a crazy idea.
And that's the balance there of, if you do anything new or innovative, there are people who are going to poo-poo it. Some things are more easily tested at a smaller scale than others. How much of an investment? I mean, when it comes to streaming, that was probably is that type of thing that required a big upfront investment even to even test it for real at all. Like with content, they could develop a couple of films, they could develop a couple of series as a small test of change, and I think they had some hits and they had some success, and then they could go more broadly. Amazon bought. Did they buy Paramount or Universal? No, they bought Universal.
MGM?
Amazon, MGM. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, but Amazon bought a studio,
right,
after doing their own experiments and small tests of change with producing content. But yeah, you're right. That's an interesting. Those are two interesting pivots that they've gone through.
Yeah, and I think the whole idea. Why are we talking? It's one thing for a big giant company, and again, we forget that Netflix wasn't always a big giant company. But it's one thing for a big giant company to make such a bet, right? But for a lot of our listeners that are just in the lean world or in the process improvement world, there's still a such thing as a crazy idea, right? And I'm at an adjustable desk, but the idea of a stand-up desk, other than for tellers and certain other certain jobs where it's pretty common, for most people, the idea of a stand-up desk being a good thing was a crazy idea, right? So it doesn't matter what level we're talking about. Crazy ideas can get dismissed way too early, right? By the people that have them, by the people they're trying to sell them to, or the people that they need to get on board so they can move forward. And so it's a very common experience. I think we've all been on both sides of that, meaning we've had a crazy idea that got squashed before it came to fruition, or we've been the one squashing the crazy idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And, going back 11 years ago when KaiNexus was just coming to market, the co-founders had a vision. They had a belief that, a web-based system would be helpful for continuous improvement. There were far more people back then saying, no, people aren't going to use that, or people shouldn't use that. But at some point, you only need enough who agree, right, to get started. You're not going to have everybody become your customer. But now, as 10 years have rolled by, there's been more acceptance of digital platforms, especially in larger companies, as more people are working remotely. People started building their own version of a digital platform. I still think our biggest competitor at KaiNexus is, we're going to build something in SharePoint. I'm like,
oh yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
You could do that, or you could buy a commercial solution that you configure. So there's more and more people coming around.
Yeah.
To that vision. I at the time I believed in it, but there's that question of like, is this a bad idea, or are we a little bit ahead of the curve? Only time will tell.
Yeah, and how much do you want to stick with it? I think KaiNexus is interesting because, again, do you need to convince everybody? No. I mean, you were competing with free, right? And that's really the interesting thing is, what did people do? They put up whiteboards. And there was a company, I can't remember. I know I spent quite a bit of time promoting them. but it was they did customizable whiteboards. Huge catalog, right? We just about carried their catalog around with them with us because it was such a powerful tool to have all these different whiteboard configurations and tools. And so that wasn't totally free, but most people had a whiteboard, and you take some masking tape and you have a chart up on a wall, and so you're competing with free, right? And so to then go ahead and say, no, we know people can solve this problem on their own for free, but we think this is so much better that people are willing to pay for it. It takes some guts to proceed and go forward, but as you said, you only need a couple people to believe that it's worth getting started, and then you can see where things go from there. But you have to be willing to know what you're willing to risk, sacrifice, or put up with in order to bring your idea to fruition. Whether that's a new business idea, in which case what you're giving up is maybe money and a few years of your life, which is a big ask, or just an idea that you believe in that you're going to have to push for a while and maybe get looked at funny and get criticized a few times. And that's what you're willing to risk or sacrifice or put up with in order to bring your idea to fruition. But there's a cost to it, right? Either way, there's a cost to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to, I think I'm remembering this properly. I think part of Jim McCann's point with his story was this generalized advice. I'm curious what you would think to this, Jamie. If somebody's not telling you this idea is crazy, that maybe you're not being bold enough in terms of a new company or a new service or a new product line.
Yeah, I believe in figuring out where the line is by bumping into it, right? Not always. I think there's a time and a place, but and a way in which you do it respectfully, et cetera. But I'll use a soccer coaching analogy. I would never tell my kids, "Hey, I want you to get a yellow card." But if you aren't ever getting a yellow card, then you haven't figured out where the boundary of aggression is, right? I don't want you to be ruled offside, but if you're never offside, are you really pushing the limits of how far you can get in an advanced position? So that's a feedback loop, right? Use it to your advantage to find out where the lines are. And so, like I said, not all risks are created equal. You have to be aware, and it's not about being reckless. But yeah, this is why I love the concept of ideal state, because if you start with what's feasible, you'll never be aggressive enough, right? So I'll try to explain it because most of our people are listeners and not watching. If you have a filter on your ideas about what you want to do, like what's a good idea, and then on top of that, you put another filter about what's feasible, and you try to have these two filters operating at the same time, very little gets through. But if you can put stuff through the filter of what you want to do, sift through that, and then later put it through a filter of what's feasible, much more gets through. And so that's why I love, like, let's think about what good looks like, and then we can back off from there, right? Trim it back until it becomes feasible.
Yeah. Like a lot of things, I mean, there's the need to find balance. So coming back to continuous improvement ideas, when is incrementalism okay? Incrementalism is safe. We can go and test small changes. When do we need to try to have a bigger leap? Like, when do we refine the existing process, and when do we need to metaphorically blow it up and rebuild it from scratch?
Right. Yeah, I was talking with somebody about their layout and recently, and it hadn't really been dramatically touched for probably at least a decade, and so they were talking about sort of a couple of phases. Phase one is do what we know we can do, and phase two is a more bold transformation. And they don't know what either is yet, but I said, well, I said two things. One, don't close yourself off to just jumping straight to phase two. If you look at it and you're like, yeah, this is better, then what are we waiting for? And then the second thing is, if you at least know what phase two looks like, at least use phase one to run some experiments to test how well phase two might work, right? And so I think that's the idea, is making sure you have a lean, a learn forward approach to these changes, right? I mean, FedEx. Um, I'm always cautious of being too committed to a vision, because you go listen to any of these companies that we've talked about, and none of them are actually doing what they first set out to do. They set forward with a bold idea and then pivoted multiple times,
right,
in the pursuit of feasible and fit, right?
Right. Pivoting or evolving or what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So it still requires flexibility. I think the idea of stick to your guns, hang on to your idea, don't change it, don't let anybody tell you your idea is wrong, and just be stubborn, right? That often is how the advice comes off, and I think that's not useful advice, because then you're not listening to why people are resisting your idea. I think you really have to dig in to understand what's behind people's reactions.
Yeah. And bringing it back to whiskey and the Woodinville folks here, like if somebody started a distillery totally committed to the idea of, I am going to bring muscatel finished bourbons to the world, and that's how I define my company, that would be hugely risky. And I'm not saying that's their history or their thought process. But let's say if you had a very niche idea like that, you could maybe first come to market with something that's more appealing to everybody. And then you could, at some point, you say, well, I think a muscatel finished bourbon would be amazing. At some point, all you can do is start experimenting with one barrel and different types of muscatel barrels from different producers or different regions. And then at some point experiment and try to validate the idea. And can you make it, back to the startup questions of, can I produce this and should I produce this? The technical means of doing it. Okay, sure. You could put whiskey into a muscatel barrel and it would, but then will people buy it? At some point, all you can do is test that. And maybe, that distillery release is a small test of change.
Right. Yeah, and I think you see so many distilleries also that if you say, hey, I'm going to start a distillery and I'm only going to use my own juice, well, then you're not selling anything for 4+ years, right? And so almost all of them start by buying some juice from someone else, and they still know enough about what they're doing that they fit a taste profile, but then they're while they're getting their stuff aged, while they're distilling and aging in barrels and all of that, Willet is fairly well known brand. They're not a major, but they're up there, and I think we've had it on the show.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah,
but for the longest time they weren't using their own stuff, their own distilled juice. And so I think even their main bourbon, their pot still bourbon, I had one that, that I knew wasn't produced by them. And then the next bottle of that I bought was.
Yeah.
And, I didn't do a side-by-side comparison because this one was gone. but that would have been interesting to see where it is. But the whole idea is, how do we reduce the risk? Well, we'll start buying juice and, trying to make sure it tastes like what we want ours to taste like. While we're building our brand and making our product.
Yeah. The one tip off, I'm not saying this was the case at Willet, but if you go to a distillery that has only been in business 5 years and they're selling a 10-year aged whiskey, they're not time travelers. They've bought stuff that's older and it could be delicious. And there's some art and skill. Let's say if they age it a little more, they use a secondary barrel. Blending is an art.
Blending is absolutely an art. Yep. And so blending and just barrel selection, there's quite a bit to that, which is why these single barrels and master distiller picks are quite popular, because they're like, oh yeah, that guy has a
Yeah.
That guy has a nose for the right barrel, and so if they pick that barrel, then that's a good barrel. That's worth tasting.
So I think the different themes here tonight we connected the dots, I think, better than I thought we did, or I thought we would. But maybe the last one we're going to talk about that leads up to a closing fun question. Talk about experiments and trying new things, and for what purpose. We want to thank Dan Markovitz, a friend of ours, for sharing a story from NPR, and I'm sure it's in other sources, about fighting intensive crabs with whiskey. What does that mean? Are you going to try to poison them with whiskey? Well, no. But I guess there are these green crabs, a dreadfully invasive species. That's a huge problem. It's eating a lot of clams and mussels. So there's a distiller, Tamworth Distilling. Will Robinson decided to tackle the invasive species by bottling them. So it says, and I started getting repulsed hearing this. He distills crab stock in a vacuum still and then adds spices, and which is then mixed with bourbon to create a product. So there was somebody, I think, on the kind of nature expert side talking about how bad the species was. And she said, so even though crab whiskey alone can't fix the problem, she hopes it helps by raising awareness. So they had some good PR people, and this is on the national news. So I guess the closing fun question is, Jamie, would you drink this?
Well, I found it interesting, in the little interview with the guy, he said, well, people are skeptical, but once they try it, they come around to it for the most part. Here you have a chance to be like,
right.
You've like 15 seconds to celebrate what you're doing, and you're kind of like, you still pull your punches, which makes me think it ain't so hot, right?
Yeah.
But I have to say, there's no chance of me buying it. I don't like gimmicks that much anyway. Yeah. Sometimes I even wonder if secondary finishing is a gimmick, and it's not, right? We just talked about it, and it's great, but I'm not a big fan of gimmicks. Would I even try a free sample in a store? I'd probably think twice before doing that. If a friend poured a glass for me, I would take a sip. I would drink it out of at least politeness. But it does not, they didn't even make it sound appealing, and they're the ones trying to sell it.
So well, do people now think that an electronic solution to help with continuous improvement is a good idea? For the most part. But
so
thankfully,
would you drink it? Would you drink it? Would you stock it? Would you give it to friends?
I would not buy a bottle of it without tasting it first. So there's back to that idea of a small test of change. It is, I think, ideal if you can taste something and decide if it works for you before committing to a bottle. So would I try a sample at a store or in a tasting room somewhere? Probably. I don't know if I would have a strong hypothesis that I would like it. So then I don't know if being biased against it means, you could be pleasantly surprised, but I wouldn't buy a bottle. I wouldn't take that risk as much as, I guess, I'm in favor of not destroying native mussel and crab crops and the impact that has on the environment and the seafood industry and what have you. But I did have an opportunity recently, though. There's a place across the river from Cincinnati called the Old Kentucky Bourbon Bar, and you can do flights. And maybe this is a pandemic law loosening, where there was one that I had in that flight. It was a wild turkey. It was they call it Kentucky Spirit, so it's kind of a higher end wild turkey. That was a barrel pick of theirs. And I tried it, and that was by far the standout of the three in the flight. Well, I could buy a bottle and take that home. So we did.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I might not, I don't dislike wild turkey, but I might not have taken the plunge on a $85 bottle of whiskey without tasting it first.
Right. Especially if it just says wild turkey, because there's a wide range coming out of Turkey, and yeah, and that's, I know a lot of, in those areas, there's a lot of store picks, right, and or bar picks, and they pick a barrel and then they bottle it, and they sell it in a flight, and they sell it by the bottle. But yeah, I think it's a great scheme, a great opportunity. And if this was really, saving the environment through whiskey, that'd be one thing. But of course, it was just a PR stunt, if you will, and it got them on NPR, and so good for them, right? I'm glad they certainly found an angle that got them on NPR talking about this real problem.
So the lesson learned is we need to make a Kinexus bourbon.
Kinexus bourbon. It's virtual. It's it's not going to work. So yeah, we'll see. If you submit your 15th improvement, you get a bottle. We'll see how that goes. So yeah, thanks for coming on and chatting tonight, sharing your podcast, and lots of great stories coming out of my favorite mistake. It's amazing you're on. We're still on episode 34 of this, but that was episode 172. So
yeah.
You've really been prolific with that. So
well, I thank my guests, and I'm thankful that people are willing to talk about mistakes publicly. That was the risk. I mean, it wasn't a huge risk, right? It wasn't like the risk of building a giant factory. If I started this podcast and I couldn't get more than a handful of people to talk about mistakes, well, it would have just ended. But
yep. All right. So just a reminder to folks, if they want to listen more, go to leanwhiskey.com. Spelled Key or KY, either spelling works.
I need to get used to, now that I'm going back to Scotland, I need to be spelling it whiskey with KY at the end, as they do.
Yes, and all your proper Scottish toasts say things properly. So you can also visit either of our websites, jflinch.com/leanwhiskey, or for Mark,
leanblog.org/lean whiskey. And you can find us. If you're listening to us, you've already found us. But if you found us on the web, let's say, you can also find us in all of the usual places: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more.
And please do, rate us, review us, give us feedback, follow, hit the little notification bell, whatever that is. And, for your listen, and it helps other people find it. We love the feedback. Any of your comments, write us an email. Please engage with us any way you can.
Yeah, and I should mention also, and maybe we'll put this into our standard work. You can also find us on YouTube if you want to see our faces, and if you don't, just listen. You can listen through your podcast app.
Absolutely. So, until next time, Mark. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
And again, happy 3rd birthday to the podcast.
Happy birthday.
Yeah.